What's something you wish your family would just admit already?
I had always imagined graduation day as one of those rare milestones where everything slowed down just enough for me to finally feel like I was part of something bigger than myself. A day when years of staying up until 3 in the morning rewriting essays that professors would barely skim, of taking night shifts at the diner to pay for textbooks my parents called unnecessary extras, would come together in a single moment of recognition. Everyone around me seemed to have their version of that perfect scene: a mother holding a camera and crying into a tissue, a father fumbling with balloons or flowers, a younger sibling waving so frantically you wondered if their arm might fall off. And yet, when I looked up from my seat in the auditorium, scanning the rows of chairs with a lump in my throat, all I found were empty spaces where my parents should have been. The chairs were still there, cold and upright, but the people who had raised me, who had promised that they were proud of me in every phone call where they barely listened, had chosen to spend the evening elsewhere. The truth hit harder when I realized they hadn't even bothered with excuses. They had told me vaguely during the week that Lily, my younger sister, had something important scheduled, and I, ever the optimist who had learned to lower expectations, assumed it meant a work commitment or some appointment she couldn't move. But as the ceremony began and the first names were called, my phone buzzed inside my purse, and there it was, a photo posted online, my parents grinning beside Lily at a hotel banquet hall, standing under a banner that read, State Business Scholars Award Ceremony. My mother had written, "So proud of our brilliant girl, couldn't miss this for the world," with hearts and clapping emojis scattered like confetti across the caption. I sat frozen, hearing my classmates cheer for one another, while I stared at the glowing screen, realizing that in their eyes, my moment wasn't worth the drive. I tried to remind myself this wasn't new. Lily had always been the one who sparkled just the right way in photographs, the one teachers adored, the one who collected trophies and certificates like other kids collected baseball cards. I wasn't resentful of her achievements, I just resented the way they erased me. While she was being praised for winning regional debate tournaments, I was working part-time jobs to keep gas in my car, and no one in my family ever thought that survival deserved applause. It was as if my hard-earned persistence was invisible because it couldn't be framed on the living room wall. The auditorium was packed, the air buzzing with chatter, families leaning across aisles to pass cameras and flowers. The woman seated 2 chairs over whispered to her husband about how proud she was of their son, her voice breaking as she dabbed her eyes. I wanted to shrink into my seat, to vanish into the floor before anyone could notice that when my name was called, no one would shout, no one would stand, and no one would hold up a phone to capture the moment. It wasn't just disappointment I felt, it was humiliation, the kind that twists in your stomach and makes you feel like you've been left naked in front of an audience that doesn't know whether to laugh or pity you. And yet, there was another feeling rising beneath it, something sharper, almost electric. Anger mixed with a bitter sort of amusement. Because while my parents posed with my sister, smiling for likes and comments, I was sitting here alone, with nothing but a program booklet clutched in my lap. The contrast was almost cinematic. I could already picture them refreshing their notifications, basking in praise from relatives and neighbors, while back at the university their other daughter's name would echo through the hall with no one to answer it. By the time the dean began calling students row by row, I had managed to paste on a polite expression, the kind of smile you wear when someone takes a photo at work even though you're running on no sleep. But inside, my chest was tight with something close to rage. It wasn't just about this day, it was about every time they had dismissed me with phrases like, "Not everything needs to be a big deal," every time they had said, "You're independent, you don't need us hovering," while they hovered endlessly over Lily. I thought of the way they bragged about her college acceptances at family dinners while forgetting to mention that I had been the first to leave home, the first to pay rent, the first to scrape together tuition without anyone co-signing a loan. When my row finally stood, I followed the line to the stage, the clap of shoes on the wooden steps ringing louder in my ears than the applause. I forced myself to look straight ahead, not at the families waving, not at the balloons bouncing in the air, not at the sea of phones flashing like stars. For a split second, I let myself imagine my parents there, my mother clutching a bouquet, my father fumbling with his camera, Lily rolling her eyes, but secretly proud. The image dissolved almost instantly, replaced by the reality of their absence. My name was called, the syllables hanging in the air, and I crossed the stage with a practiced smile, shaking the dean's hand as if nothing inside me was unraveling. The applause sounded distant, almost hollow, but it didn't matter. What mattered was the decision forming in my mind, solidifying with every step I took back toward my seat. If my parents thought I would fade quietly into the background while they collected compliments online, they were mistaken. This wasn't going to end with me swallowing the humiliation and moving on. I sat back down, diploma folder in hand, my heart pounding not from pride, but from the weight of a plan beginning to take shape. It wasn't dramatic yet. It was a flicker of possibility, a small voice whispering that I didn't have to let them win this narrative. I could already feel the edges of revenge, not cruel but calculated, curling at the corners of my thoughts. They had chosen to ignore me, to erase me in favor of a shinier version of a daughter, but I would find a way to remind them, and everyone else in that room, that I was still here. And in that moment, sitting alone while the ceremony marched on, I realized that if they weren't going to be present, then I would make their absence unforgettable. I didn't know how yet, but the determination felt like steel in my veins. This wasn't going to be just another disappointment, it was going to be the turning point. When the next student's name was called and the crowd erupted once more, I held on to that thought like a lifeline. Because if my parents couldn't be bothered to show up, then I would make sure that by the end of the night, everyone else in this auditorium remembered exactly who had. By the time the ceremony reached the awkward intermission where the dean shuffled note cards and the student body president whispered with an usher about some last-minute change, I had decided that if I couldn't get the kind of family photo every store uses on its graduation displays, then I would at least get a moment that belonged to me. Not to their curated feed or to anyone else's idea of how a good daughter is supposed to swallow disappointment with grace and a polite thank you, and as if the universe had been listening in on my private mutiny, the assistant coordinator hustled down our row, leaned into the aisle, and asked whether anyone who had registered as a backup speaker was present because the valedictorian had lost her voice overnight and the alternate had come down with a stomach bug that was doing laps around the dorms. I hadn't registered as a backup because when you grow up being told you're low maintenance, you stop asking to be considered, yet my hand went up. Before my brain finished arguing with the old script, and 10 minutes later I was in a side hallway, clutching a wrinkled printout of the official program and being told that if I could keep it to a few minutes, avoid politics and mention donors at least once, I would be doing everyone a favor. Standing there under fluorescent lights that made everyone look a shade paler than real life, I felt an odd calm slide into place. The kind that arrives when you recognize a door has opened and no one's going to hold it for you, but it is still, undeniably, open. And while the coordinator relayed directions into her headset, I pulled out my phone, scrolled to the photo my mother had posted of Lily grinning with her plaque, and I pinched it wider until all I could see were my parents' faces tilted toward the camera with that practiced affection that plays well online. Then I closed it and opened my notes app and started mapping the bones of a speech that would sound gracious to anyone who wanted to hear grace, but would carry, tucked inside it, enough cold truth to make the air thicken. I wasn't interested in names or accusations. I was interested in absence, in the way silence can shout if you give it a microphone. Maybe it sounds theatrical, and maybe it was, but I kept thinking about how, when I was a kid, my mother loved to tell the story of how I learned to ride a bike by launching myself down the cul-de-sac without training wheels because no one was watching closely enough to stop me, and how she would laugh and say I had always been independent in a way that was convenient, which is a charming line at a barbecue, but lands differently when you are the person who had to be convenient, and as I drafted the rhythm of what I wanted to say, I realized I didn't want to beg for sympathy or even for attention. I wanted to make absence visible, to hold it up like a negative of a photograph and let people trace the outline of what should have been there. The director poked his head around the door to tell me I was on after the dean, that the microphone was sensitive, that the teleprompter wouldn't have my text, and whether I understood that the donors appreciated an acknowledgement. I told him I did. Which wasn't a lie because I planned to thank everyone, even the ghosts. Right then my phone buzzed again with a message from my mother that said she hoped I was having fun and that they were so proud, followed by a link to a live stream of Lily's banquet, which I suppose was meant to include me, but only sharpen the outline of where they were not, and I typed a reply that I did not send. A tidy little sentence about how it was a shame they couldn't be here because I had a surprise, and then, because I am petty in ways I rarely admit, I did the smallest. Pettiest thing I could think of that still felt like a win. I turned off read receipts, muted the thread, and forwarded their post to an old family friend who loved to gossip with a caption that said, "Big night for the whole family." And I knew that by morning an aunt would ask my mother which event they'd attended, because surely they couldn't have been in two places at once, and while it wasn't a blowtorch, it was a pilot light, and it warmed me. The stage manager handed me a slim black folder and said the microphone would be adjusted to my height once I reached the lectern, and as I trailed him to the curtain I kept refining the line that would be the hinge. The sentence that would slice cleanly enough to leave no blood on the floor yet deep enough that everyone who needed to feel it would feel it. I thought about the parents who had showed up with cameras and banners and the ones who had mortgage time they didn't have, and I thought about the students whose people were missing for reasons much harder than vanity, and I decided that if I was going to light a match, I would hold it up for them as well. Because spite is ugly when it is only for one person, but it looks like justice when it is widened to include the others who have been standing in the dark. When the dean wrapped up his thank yous and the applause washed forward in a courteous wave, the curtain hand signaled me out, and I walked into the lights that make you understand why actors have makeup teams. And I placed the folder on the lectern and adjusted the mic the way he had shown me, and my hands stopped shaking, not because I wasn't scared, but because something steadier had taken over. A voice that had been waiting for years to be used in a way that wasn't apologizing for its own echo. I started with gratitude because it is a good doorway and because I meant it, naming professors who had quietly extended deadlines when my double shift ran long, naming classmates who shared notes when my car died, naming the donors who paid for the scholarships that kept some of us from dropping out when gas prices ate our grocery money. The audience relaxed, the director nodded from the wings, and then I turned the wheel, gently, calmly, a pilot easing into cloud cover. I said that milestones have a strange way of measuring not only what shows up, but what is not, that photographs can be beautifully framed around an empty space, and that there were people in the hall tonight who were celebrating with us in their work shoes, in hospital scrubs, on third shifts, or from far away, and there were also people who could not be here even if they wanted to be, and there were, if we were honest, a few who could have been here and chose something shinier, and then I looked out over the crowd that had grown very still, and I delivered the line I had built like a bridge in my throat, that this 90-second slice of my voice and our night, was for those who couldn't be here. It was small and it was enormous, it was polite and it was merciless, and when I stepped back for breath the silence in the room felt like a truth finally recognized. I did not look into the camera that was streaming to the parents and alumni portal because I wasn't speaking to the lens. I was speaking to the space where someone should have been sitting with flowers. And if the flowers were a fantasy, then at least the absence could be a fact that everyone witnessed together. And as the applause returned, hesitant at first, then warm in a way that confused even me, I felt the petty victory I had taken earlier stiffen into something more deliberate, because this, unlike muting a thread, could not be screen-capped or spun away later. It would live in the memory of the room, in the way the air had changed. The stage manager touched my elbow to guide me off, and I obeyed, though not before adding a final, neat thank you to the donors as promised, which made him sigh in relief. Back in the wing, the assistant coordinator told me I had nailed it in the tone adults use when they sense heat but don't know where it's coming from. And I smiled, because I was already thinking about what the line had detonated on the other end of my muted messages, whether my mother had watched the stream or whether she had chosen dessert instead, whether my father had noticed the way the room held its breath, whether Lily had felt, even for a second, the tug of being the only star in a room where the constellation didn't match the caption, and while that thought felt mean, I also knew it was honest, and I am at my best when I stop pretending otherwise. The usher waved me toward the exit where the students would filter out after the recessional, and I followed the current, not expecting to be intercepted, not expecting anything at all. Until the lobby doors opened and a late spring wind curled around my ankles, and I looked up to see Lily standing on the steps, her makeup streaked. Her phone clutched in a grip so tight the case had bent, and though I couldn't yet hear her over the music spilling from the hall, I could tell by the way her mouth formed my name that whatever had cracked online was now breaking in real life, and that the next words out of her mouth would not be congratulations. The first thing I noticed as I stepped into the wind-streaked lobby was that Lily, who had been manufactured for excellence the way some families produce heirloom china, was shivering in a cocktail dress that belonged in a ballroom rather than on university steps, her mascara carving dark tributaries down her cheeks while she tried, with the brittle poise of someone trained to smile through a sprained ankle, to pretend that the phone vibrating in her hand was not detonating her night one notification at a time, and although a small, petty part of me wanted to ask whether the dessert was worth missing a daughter's name, I swallowed it long enough to step closer and say her name in a tone that even surprised me, because it was not sharp or triumphant but low and steadied, like the voice you use when a glass is about to roll off a counter and you decide you would prefer to catch it rather than watch it shatter. She didn't look up right away, choosing instead to stare at the cracked corner of her phone case, as if the damage there could absorb the rest of the impact, and when she finally met my eyes the practiced brightness was gone, replaced by a panic I recognized from my own mirror after too many 12-hour shifts and one too many bills, and she said, in a voice that still carried the banquet echo, that their table had gone quiet during the live stream when my line landed, that our mother had laughed too quickly as if it were a joke, and our father had fumbled for the check like a man trying to outrun a siren, and that someone, an aunt, a donor, who knew, had already asked how a family could be in two places at once without cloning technology. Which would have been funny if not for the way Lily's mouth trembled around the punchline. I wanted, reflexively, to deliver the speech I keep in a drawer for emergencies, the one about how she was not the villain but a beneficiary of a system that handed out spotlights and called them merit. Yet the years had taught me that explanations rarely change what people hear, so I chose a different tool, the one I had sharpened in that side hallway, and I told her that what I said was true not because it hurt them, but because it had been true for a very long time, and that if she felt exposed it was because the photograph had finally widened to include the empty chair, and she flinched as if I had struck her, not because I raised my voice, I did not, but because the sentence did what a clean cut does, it revealed the part hidden by swelling. She recovered with the familiar pivot, insisting that the banquet had been scheduled months ago, that she had begged them to split the night, that they had promised to make both events work, and I nearly laughed. Not because it was absurd, but because it was precisely the kind of logistics fantasy our parents adored, all calendar bravado and no willingness to sit in traffic for someone else's milestone. And while she spoke I could see the way her mind was running parallel tracks, one defending the evening and the other silently asking when the performance had started to consume the performer, and I realized that if I only stood there and let her reel, then I would be no better than the people who enjoyed my speech because it sharpened their own grudges. So I allowed myself one small, strategic act of revenge that felt less like a slap and more like a mirror. I lifted my phone, framed her and me in the same wind and the same harsh lobby light, and snapped a single photo where neither of us smiled, then typed a caption that said, "Two sisters who both showed up," and posted it without hashtags, because there are times you don't need search terms to make a point. The notification sound from her phone chimed almost instantly, ricocheting off the glass doors, and she startled, checking the screen like a person checking a wound, then let out this sound that was half laugh and half sob, admitting that she had never stood next to me online without being the headline, and that this, of all ridiculous things, felt like being seen in a way no award had managed, and I felt my anger pivot again, cooling into something complicated and inconvenient, because it is hard to hate a person who is finally telling the truth, even if the truth arrives late and wearing heels. She stepped closer, lowering her voice to the volume of secrets, and told me that the scholarship board at her program had encouraged family engagement optics, which sounded like it had been designed in a fluorescent meeting room by people who drink their coffee lukewarm, and that our parents had leaned into the optics the way they leaned into everything that made them look curated and competent, and that she had gone along because saying no felt like stepping out of the only light she had ever been told was safe, and while part of me wanted to scold her for complicity, another part remembered what it costs to refuse the script everybody else is reading. I told her, with a humor that tasted like metal on my tongue, that if she wanted optics she had certainly gotten them tonight, only the brand had taken an unexpected turn toward honesty, and she almost smiled. A crooked little thing that acknowledged the wound without asking for an apology, and then she said she needed to show me something before I decided I was done with the entire family. And she unlocked her phone and scrolled through a message thread with our mother that made my stomach tighten. Not because it was cruel. Our parents never say cruel things directly. They garden their words until they look like flowers, but because it was relentless in its cheerful prioritizing. Reminders about seating charts, notes about who might be there to network, a checklist of photo opportunities, and nestled in the middle, a line about my ceremony that read, "If we can stop by at the end for a quick hug, that would be plenty." Plenty is such a strange word when you measure love in minutes rather than in presence, and before I could decide whether to be furious or exhausted, Lily reached for my wrist like we were children crossing a street and said there was more. That she had overheard something before they left the house, something that would sound like justification but would feel like gasoline, and that if I wanted to understand why they could never be in two places at once unless the other place was mine, I needed to hear it now, and in the half-second before she continued, with the music from the recessional swelling behind us and the night outside breathing cool air over my bare ankles, I understood that whatever she was about to say would not fix anything at all. It would simply rearrange the pieces so I could see the picture more clearly, which, for better or worse, is its own kind of revenge. Lily kept my wrist in that anxious grip like a person who knows the crosswalk is about to turn red and is still deciding whether to run, and when she finally found the words they tumbled out in long, careful strands that sounded rehearsed in the way confessions often are. Not because she practiced them for me, but because she had practiced them for herself, and she said that a week ago our parents had sat at the dining table with a laptop open to a calendar and a spreadsheet, the same arrangement they used for vacations and school supply budgets and every other ritual that made our life look organized from the outside, and that in between color-coded commitments she had seen a line that read Lily Banquet full presence required, and another that read commencement, optional drop-in if time allows, and she laughed then, a short brittle sound at the memory, because apparently love could be toggled like a meeting reminder, and if you put optional next to your oldest daughter's graduation you could still call yourself supportive in the family newsletter. She said she had overheard something else as she poured coffee, something our mother said under her breath to our father that landed like a carelessly thrown tool, that my ceremony did not fit the brand they were pushing right now, that the family story for the quarter was building excellence around a scholar, and that splitting the night might dilute the optics they had been cultivating with the scholarship board, the church newsletter, and the local business association that still sponsored silent auctions where families were framed like prize baskets, and while I wanted to roll my eyes so hard they stuck, the language itself sat inside me like ice, because it was precise the way a scalpel is precise. I told her I had suspected as much in blurrier terms, that I had felt the outline of a narrative where my absence was useful because it made her shine without glare, but hearing brand attached to my family made me choke a little on my own sarcasm. Which is saying something given how often sarcasm has kept me upright, and she said there was more, that our father's firm had a client on Lily's scholarship committee, a man who loved family photos where the father stands slightly behind the daughter, hands on her shoulders like an advertisement for benevolent patriarchy, and that tonight's banquet promised exactly that image on a plaque, the kind of picture you pin in a hallway and point to when the partners ask you are outside the office, and that my parents had decided, after a series of brave little euphemisms, that one important photograph was worth more than one honest presence, and if I wanted to know how she felt hearing that, I should look at the mascara maps on her face and do the math. There is a version of me that would have unloaded on her without mercy, the sister who collects wounds like evidence and presents them in trial. But the person standing in the lobby with a damp program in her bag and the echo of a microphone in her throat had more oxygen than that, and I said, with a humor so dry it scraped, that if they were pushing a brand they had better hire a crisis team because the product was having a recall, and I watched relief flicker and go out like a cheap light. Because she wanted forgiveness, and I wasn't ready to give it wholesale, and maybe I never would, which is not noble but is honest. She nodded, as if accepting an unfavorable contract, and then she did the one thing I did not expect, which was to admit that she had helped write the story. That she had asked them not to risk splitting their attention because the scholarship board liked tidy narratives, and she was afraid to be the girl whose parents slipped out to catch another daughter's milestone. And that she hated how that sentence sounded out loud because it made her look selfish in a way that wasn't entirely wrong, and I felt the room tilt because the villain had acquired shading just when I wanted a clean line to cut along. Since I am not a saint and also not entirely given to melodrama, I chose a revenge that fit the hour and my temperament, which was to take the photo I had posted of the two of us unsmiling and route it, deliberately, through the places where our family preferred their scenes to be flattering. I sent it to the alumni page moderator I knew from a statistics class with a caption about gratitude for classmates and for all the workers who were family tonight for those of us seated alone. And I tacked on a line about how this was for people who had someone at a banquet across town, not as a blade, but as a mirror. And within minutes the university account shared it with an understated headline about resilience that carried more sting than any rant I could have written, because nothing undermines a brand like a photograph that refuses to flatter. I forwarded the same image to the neighborhood group chat where my mother organized bake sales, and where every achievement was folded into the myth of our tidy street, and I let the timestamp do the talking, and then, because pettiness deserves symmetry, I texted our father's office assistant, who has always liked me more now that I am less likely to show up at receptions, and thanked her for the kindness she showed when I interned 2 summers ago, attaching the link to my speech recording and adding a gentle note that the line about those who couldn't be here meant everyone from third-shift parents to people stuck in traffic behind other people's optics, and I put the phone away because I did not want to watch the ripples. I wanted to feel the quiet click of a boundary sliding into place. Lily watched me do exactly none of this because I did it fast and calm between sentences, which is a skill you learn when you have worked service jobs and needed to fix 3 things before your table notices the 4th. And she took a breath that sounded like surrender and said she had one last thing before our parents arrived to stage a hug, because of course they were on their way with flowers and the excuse of a mix-up. And she dug into her bag and produced an envelope addressed to me in our mother's tidy handwriting, sealed but creased as if it had been carried around for a while, and she said it was meant for a board member at her program, but that my name had been written on it because optics prefer clean labels even when the contents are messy. I slid a finger under the flap and unfolded a letter that was not a letter so much as a pitch, a testimonial about our family's dedication to excellence that called me fiercely independent in the tone people use when they mean fine on her own, and that framed our absence at my ceremony as honoring previous obligations, and there was a sentence about how I prefer autonomy over fuss, which is a neat way to describe ignoring someone without getting your hands dirty. And Lily whispered that she had begged them to leave that sentence out and they had not, because it solved a problem they needed solved. The doors opened then with the timing of a stage cue, and our parents stepped in with the startled brightness of people who have run a yellow light and are pretending it was green, my mother clutching a bouquet that had the aggressive neatness of florists who follow trends, my father adjusting his tie as if the knot could reframe the evening, and my own revenge settled into my posture like a new spine, because I realized I didn't have to deny them the photograph or the hug to win. I could decide the terms, and that, for someone branded independent, is the kind of payback that doesn't need an audience. I handed the envelope back to Lily and told her she could decide what to do with it, then stepped forward before our mother could choreograph the moment and said I would be happy to take a picture of Lily with them because tonight belonged to her banquet storyline and I would no longer audition for a part 1 had not been offered. And while they blinked at the rearranged script I raised my phone, framed them against the lobby light, and counted slowly, letting the pause register like a verdict. And just as I was about to press the shutter, Lily said my name with that tremor again and confessed, so low I could feel the words more than hear them, that there was one more reason they had stayed at her banquet, one that had nothing to do with donors or promotions or any of the nonsense they could argue away later, and that if I wanted the truth with the lights all the way up, I should ask our father why my scholarship counselor stopped returning my calls last fall. I did not ease into it with niceties or a warm-up joke about traffic because the moment had already decided its own temperature, so when my parents stepped into the lobby with their customer service smiles and that bouquet arranged like a sales pitch, I asked my father, in a voice that felt like the edge of a countertop, why my scholarship counselor had stopped returning my calls last fall, and whether he preferred I ask him here where the acoustics were kind or out on the steps where the wind would carry his answer down the block, which, for a man who prides himself on reading rooms, was enough to make his eyes flick up toward the mezzanine as if an exit might materialize beside the donor plaque. He began with the old choreography about misunderstandings and overloaded inboxes and the difficulty of the season, then reached for the script about how families must prioritize in complicated times, and I let him waltz exactly 2 sentences before I told him that the counselor had called me the previous week after my appointment kept getting shuffled, that she had apologized in a voice people reserve for things they wish they had not agreed to, and that she had used the phrase external pressure from people with influence, which is polite code for someone's father asking a professional to cool an application because the timing did not serve the larger picture, and my mother, who can camouflage almost anything with a compliment, made the fatal mistake of telling me not to be dramatic, which would have been funny if the room hadn't gone so quiet that even the building's old vent system sounded like it was listening. I said that if the concern had been money, there were honest ways to say so, and if the concern had been distance, then we could have had an adult conversation without treating my future like a variable in someone else's quarterly narrative. And if the concern had been the firm's client who sits on the scholarship committee and loves a family photo where the father looks like a benevolent lighthouse, then he could choose whether to be a parent or a project manager, because the job requirements are not the same, and I was done pretending they were, and I watched the denial rise and fall in him like a tide that has missed high water, until finally he said he had only asked the counselor to consider whether I might thrive better without additional pressure this cycle, and that he had meant it as protection, and he placed a hand on my shoulder like a benediction that had not been earned, and I stepped back because there are gestures you do not accept when they arrive wrapped in euphemism. Lily, who had been holding her breath so fiercely I could almost see the outline of it in the air, told him that the word he was looking for was interference, and that if he wanted to call it love he should take a number and wait his turn behind the people who showed up without a camera. It would have been easy, and honestly satisfying in a childish way, to explode right there and scorch the evening to ashes, but I had already decided that my revenge would not be heat, it would be architecture. So I took the bouquet from my mother with a thank you that was as gentle as a shove, handed it to a facilities worker who had been holding the door open for families for an hour, and asked if she would deliver it to the night shift crew because they were the ones who had made our milestone possible without being seen, and then I asked my father for his phone so I could airdrop him the recording I had made of my call with the counselor, not to humiliate him in public, but to make the truth non-negotiable in private. And when he refused on principle, I sent it anyway to his office email and copied the scholarship board address listed on the program with a note that said I would like my file reopened because I had withdrawn nothing and consented to nothing, and if anyone needed confirmation, they could consult the timestamped message thread where my appointments had been canceled after unspecified outreach, which I attached because I am done being low maintenance, when maintenance is just another word for silence. My mother, who has always believed that a photograph can fix most narratives if you choose the right filter, asked if we might please take one together before we left so she could post a caption about 2 proud nights in one family. And I said I had an even better idea, then placed her beside Lily with the bouquet that was no longer ours, positioned my father not behind them but off to the side where the plaque naming donors could claim him fairly, and set my phone to video while framing a Still, because there are moments you want to live as both proof and memory, and I asked them to hold their smiles just a beat longer while I said, for the benefit of the microphone and for my own spine, that I was grateful to every person who had stood in for a family tonight, that I had learned the difference between presence and publicity the hard way, and that I would be posting a link to the speech with a thank you to those who couldn't be here, which, as it turns out, includes people who chose to be elsewhere, and then I clicked, not to trap them, but to mark the exact second the story shifted its weight. When we stepped outside, the air smelled like damp concrete and newly opened doors, and Lily asked whether I wanted a ride or a late dinner or a truce, and I told her I wanted something smaller and harder, which was a pause long enough to notice that the night was still mine even if the photo albums would tell a different story in some houses. And we stood there with our heels sinking into the softened asphalt while my phone began to buzz with replies from the board and from classmates and from the counselor, who wrote back a single line that said, "I'm available to speak on record," which hit with the delicate violence of justice arriving in work shoes, and I laughed, not kindly but not cruelly either. Because humor can be a blade or a bandage depending on the angle, and I told Lily that what happened next would not be loud, it would be consistent, that I would keep applying, keep sending, keep CCNG the right addresses, and that if our parents wanted a brand they could build one. Around resilience they didn't orchestrate. We walked in different directions on purpose, not as a final rupture, but as proof that parallel lines can be honest without touching, and, while I did not look back, I could feel the picture forming behind me, a family in a lobby, a bouquet moving toward hands that would appreciate it, a father checking his email under an unforgiving light, and a daughter whose revenge was not to ruin the night, but to refuse to be optional ever again, which may not be cinematic, but in the long view where the credits never really roll, is more than enough.